if you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who wants to really get what's going on in the world, right? And you want to do it without wading through a ton of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, today we are going deep on something that has had a huge impact, not just on the U.S., but globally. The Trump administration's tariff policies.
Big topic.
It is a big one. We've got a whole bunch of articles and research to go through, and we are going to try to break it down for you so you can really understand what these tariffs were all about, why they happened, and what the lasting impacts have been.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case study, kind of a pivotal moment in the whole, story of global trade in a way.
Definitely a turning point. I mean, if we think back to before Trump took office, the general trend globally was towards more open trade, producing barriers and creating more interconnected economies.
Right, yeah, the kind of free trade consensus that had been building for decades.
But then America First came along, and that really shook things up.
Yeah, it did. It was a real departure.
Yeah, the focus shifted to things like protecting national economic security and addressing those trade imbalances that were always in the headlines.
Right, and it wasn't just about the economics either.
No, there was a real change in the overall philosophy of trade. Instead of seeing it as something where, everyone could benefit, it became much more about competition, kind of a zero-sum game.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It was like suddenly trade deficits were seen as this huge vulnerability, a threat to American power.
And the tariffs themselves were pretty wide-ranging.
Oh, they were all over the place.
One of the main targets was China. They put tariffs on a ton of Chinese goods, everything from electronics to clothing.
Yeah, it caused some serious tensions, for sure.
Major trade war, yeah.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't just China. They even put tariffs on allies like Canada and Mexico.
Right, and those were initially tied to things that weren't even directly related to trade, like immigration and drug trafficking.
Really complicated the situation, yeah. Although the USMCA, the new trade agreement that replaced NAFTA, did create some exceptions for certain products.
Right, like energy products and potash.
Yeah, so you can see how different factors were driving these decisions.
Definitely. It was a mix of economic and political considerations.
And then there were the steel and aluminum tariffs. Those were big ones.
Yeah, they really hit a lot of countries hard.
Those were justified on national security grounds, which is interesting.
It is, because it kind of expanded the definition of what could be considered a national security threat.
Exactly. It wasn't just about, weapons or something like that. They were arguing that relying on other countries for these key materials made the U.S. vulnerable.
Right, and that argument had a lot of implications because it could potentially be applied to all sorts of things.
It could, yeah. And then there was the idea of a universal baseline tariff, meaning a tariff that would apply to almost every country.
And on top of that, they were talking about adding even higher reciprocal tariffs for countries that had big trade deficits with the U.S.
Okay, so those reciprocal tariffs, that's something we need to unpack a bit.
Yeah, it's a key part of how the administration was thinking about trade.
Basically, they defined reciprocal tariffs as matching the tariffs that other countries put on American exports, right?
Exactly. It was like, if you're going to charge us X% on our goods, we're going to charge you X% on yours.
But it wasn't quite that simple.
No, it wasn't. The way they determined what was fair or unfair went beyond just looking at the tariffs themselves.
Right. They were also looking at things like non-tariff barriers,
Yeah.
which could be anything from regulations to quotas that made it harder for American businesses to compete.
Right. And even things like currency manipulation and government subsidies for foreign companies were factored in.
And they even looked at trade surpluses, meaning how much more a country was exporting to the U.S. than they were importing.
Yeah, that was a big one for them.
So how would they have actually calculated these reciprocal tariffs? It sounds pretty complicated.
It was. There was a whole formula they used based on economic modeling and all that.
So in practice, what would that have looked like?
Well, a simplified way to think about it is they would take the trade deficit the U.S. had with a country and divide it by the total value of imports from that country. And then they would cut that number in half.
Okay, so the bigger the deficit and the smaller the overall trade volume, the higher the reciprocal tariff could be.
Right. And there was usually a minimum tariff of 10%, no matter what.
Wow, that's significant.
It is. It shows how serious they were about trying to rebalance trade.
So let's talk about what actually happened when these tariffs went into effect. What was the impact?
Well, it varied depending on the industry and the specific tariffs, but there were definitely some common themes.
Like with steel and aluminum, for example, prices went up, which made sense.
Yeah, less competition from imports usually means higher prices.
That might have been good for some domestic steel and aluminum producers. But what about the companies that used those materials to make other things?
They got hit with higher costs, which squeezed their profits and could have led to higher prices for consumers down the line.
Right, that makes sense. And agriculture was really hit hard by the retaliatory tariffs, especially from China, Canada, and Mexico.
Oh, yeah, they lost a lot of export markets, which really hurt farmers.
And it wasn't just the direct impact of the tariff, there was also a ripple effect throughout the economy.
Absolutely. That's the thing about global trade. It's all interconnected.
So when the U.S. put tariffs on goods from one country, that country might retaliate by putting tariffs on U.S. goods, which could hurt a completely different industry.
Right. And it also created a lot of uncertainty for businesses. They didn't know what to expect, so they were hesitant to invest or make long-term plans.
Yeah, it really disrupted those global supply chains that we rely on for so many products.
Yeah, the auto industry is a perfect example. Cars are made with parts from all over the world, and these tariffs threw a wrench into the whole system.
Made it a lot more expensive to build cars.
Exactly. And that's just one example.
And internationally, things got pretty tense.
Yeah, we saw trade wars breaking out between the U.S. and some of its biggest trading partners like China, Canada, Mexico, and even the European Union.
And all of this had a ripple effect on the global economy.
It did. International organizations like the IMF and the OECD started lowering their forecasts for global economic growth because trade wars tend to slow things down.
And what about the impact on the U.S. economy?
Well, there are a lot of different opinions on that, but most economists agreed that the tariffs weren't all positive.
They weren't.
No, there were definitely some downsides.
Okay, so what were some of those downsides?
Well, for one thing, economists started revising down their projections for U.S. GDP growth. They were expecting the economy to grow more slowly because of the tariffs.
Oh, that's not good. And were there concerns about job losses?
Yeah, definitely. Some industries that relied on imported goods or that exported a lot of products to countries that were hit with retaliatory tariff were worried about layoffs.
And wasn't there also an impact on inflation?
Yeah, the Federal Reserve Chair, who's basically in charge of the U.S. central bank, said that the tariffs were likely contributing to higher prices for consumers.
Right, because when the cost of imported goods goes up, those costs get passed along to consumers.
Exactly.
So it sounds like there were a lot of unintended consequences from these tariffs.
There were. It's a really complex issue, and it's hard to predict all the effects.
Right. It's not just about, one country winning and another country losing. It's much more nuanced than that.
Exactly. It's like a giant web, and when you tug on one strand, you never know what else you might be affecting.
It's interesting how these trade policies ended up being connected to so many other issues, too.
Yeah, everything from inflation to international relations.
And where do things stand now? What's the current policy?
Well, the current administration has mostly kept those tariffs in place.
They have. So they're still focused on that idea of reciprocal trade and reducing trade deficits.
Yeah, but they've also said that they're willing to make adjustments based on what other countries do.
So there's still some flexibility there.
There is.
Well, this has been a really fascinating look at a really complex topic.
It has.
I think the big takeaway here is that the Trump administration's tariff policies were a major shift from the way things had been done for decades.
Yeah, they were a real break from the past.
And they triggered a whole chain of consequences, both good and bad, that are still playing out today.
Absolutely. It's something we'll be dealing with for a long time to come.
Here's something to think about. Given how interconnected the global economy is, how might a policy that seems very focused on the U.S., like a tariff, actually have unexpected consequences in other parts of the world? And how might those consequences eventually circle back and affect us here? Thanks for diving deep with us.
Thanks for having me.